Hello, and thank you so much for attending today's SURF presentation. My name is McCabe Webb. I'm currently a sophomore at Carroll College, and I am studying history, international relations, and political science. And today we'll be speaking in the desert, reviewing the history of the Armenian Genocide and discussing why its disregard was internationalized in today's international community. All right, so let's get started. So first things first, it is important to have a background of who exactly the Armenians are. So the Armenians are their own culturally distinct ethnic group. They have their own alphabet, their own music, their own language, and their homeland was traditionally found in Asia Minor. For much of ancient history, they were actually an independent nation under a king. And when this king formally accepted Christianity in about 301 AD, they became the first country to formally accept Christianity. But then throughout the ages, they found themselves subjugated by many different groups. As empires would rise and fall, they would conquer the Armenians and they would find themselves subjugated to those conquerors. And as is important for today's presentation, they actually found themselves subjugated by both the Russian and the Ottoman empires in the early 20th century. So the Armenians were actually kind of split between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, which made tensions very high because the two were bitter rivals at the time. So this gave rise to the Armenian Question, especially in the Ottoman Empire, which essentially was, what do we do with this predominantly Christian minority that we find within our borders? So Armenians under the Ottomans had a very hard time. While the Ottomans may not have cared much about ethnic background of the various people that they conquered over their years, they cared a lot more about the religious background. So, as the Ottoman Empire was a largely Muslim empire and the Armenians were a largely Christian nation, this led to more tensions between the two. But the Ottoman Empire by the early 20th century was known as the sick man of Europe. It was crumbling at its very roots, and everyone kind of knew it. The Western powers of Europe were looking on with just bated breath, licking their lips, waiting for just even the smallest opening to just pounce and kind of section off the Ottoman Empire and take what they could get. And the Ottoman Empire knew this. They knew that the Western powers were just waiting for their chance to strike. And this led to a lot of fear and a lot of paranoia, and knowing that any one misstep could lead to their inevitable ruin. They're also suffering from many demographic and economic problems. The demographic problems came in the form that it does for most empires. As they would go through and conquer more land, they would find more people under their rule, people of varying ethnicities and religions. And these people would always demand for equal treatment as they deserved. But they didn't always grant these minorities equal treatment. So as these minorities saw that the Ottoman Empire was crumbling, they began to reach out louder and louder, calling for equal treatment, calling for equal rights. And the Ottoman Empire had a very hard time dealing with this. And economic problems were that the Ottoman Empire was essentially going bankrupt and failing horribly economically. And many of its citizens were doing the same, which led to another tensions between many of the Ottoman constituents and the Armenians. Because the Armenians were largely Christian, many of the Western powers wanted to intervene and would send missionaries to the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians would welcome these missionaries with open arms and go to their schools and get a Western style education, which would lead to them being economically profitable in the future and running profitable businesses, which was a very distinct contrast from their neighbors who did not welcome the Western missionaries and were therefore not as well educated and in many cases much less economically successful, which was a huge point of tension, especially as the Ottoman continued to crumble. The Ottoman Empire also suffered from pressures from within, from ethnic minorities, as we discussed, and without from the just pressures of the West. And it got to the point where the Ottoman Empire actually had to concede capitulations to the West, officially allowing them to interfere in Ottoman business on behalf of the Armenian minorities due to the fact of them being Christian. So this was another factor that just really kind of shook the groundwork of the Ottoman Empire and made them really resent the Armenians, because not only were they being more economically successful than many of their average constituents, but they also saw them as almost collaborating with the West, even though they weren't really in the Western countries, more wanted to make sure that the Armenians were being treated with equal rights. So as empires begin to crumble, as their power and legitimacy begins to fade, and their minorities start to rise up and demand more rights, they usually turn to nationalism, which for the Ottoman Empire came in the form of Turkification. Turkification, if you'll forgive the analogy, was very much like make the Ottoman Empire Turkic again. So the Ottoman Empire essentially appealed to the nationalism and ethnic pride of many of the Turkish people within it, calling for the Ottoman Empire to just be Turkic again, for the Turkish to be able to rule everything and have the high positions in society, and appealing to this dynamic nationalism to retain its legitimacy and have any reason for people to support it and continue its rule. So when nationalism is appealed to only one group, inevitably scapegoats others. And the scapegoats, especially in the Ottoman Empire, came in the form of the Armenians, who were turned into scapegoats and blamed for virtually anything, for the economic poor performance of the Ottoman Empire, to the economic failure of many of its citizens, to the growing power of the Russian Empire, to the growing power of the West, to the decline of the Ottoman Empire overall, was all kind of shifted slowly onto the Armenians. And as more and more people began to believe this, anger just rose and boiled and was just under the surface and just waiting for any excuse to kind of burst out, because they saw how successful they were being, the differences between them, and this appeal to nationalism all kind of coalesced into kind of a disgusting hatred. And this in turn led to an othering of the Armenians, of distancing them from their neighbors and treating them as just others and dehumanizing them as much as possible. And as you can tell, the Ottoman Empire was just seething with hatred. It knew it was just crumbling in its last days. People were already sectioning it off to who would get what. And all this rage and violence found an outlet in the Armenians. So while the truth may be clear, the Ottomans certainly tried to spin their own story of why they objected to the Armenians. So, as this quote shows, the first was that they have enriched themselves at the expense of the Turks, when in reality they did no such thing. They took advantage of the Western-style education that many of the missionaries brought in, when many of their neighbors did not, due to the religious differences between the two. Second place, they were not determined to domineer over them. They were a tiny ethnic minority that had no intentions of overthrowing the Ottoman government. And maybe there were some radicals that wanted to establish their separate state in the historical land of Armenia, but that was very much in the minority. And having openly encouraged their enemies, again, there's a very small minority that were calling for the Western powers to help them out more. Most of them just took advantage of the Western education to get any foothold that they could in an empire where in the past they were routinely massacred and slaughtered for no real reason at all. So World War I kind of served as the perfect opportunity for the Ottomans to take out their hatred against the Armenians. So the Ottomans joined the First World War on the German side. They kind of jumped at the opportunity to reassert themselves in Europe, to show everyone else that they were not the sick man of Europe. They weren't dying, they weren't crumbling, even though they were. They wanted to grab some land, prove their power, prove their might, get some strong allies, and reassert themselves both over their minorities within their borders and abroad as well. But this was not the case whatsoever. They started a disastrous campaign towards Russia, which failed horribly militarily. They actually pushed well into Russia, and then Russia pushed back easily and actually invaded some of the Ottoman Empire as well. So, since the Armenians were split between the Western, both in accepting their education and their aid, as well as their entire population being split between Russia and the Ottomans, the Ottoman government started to blame the Armenians for this defeat, accusing them of sabotage, accusing them of spying, accusing them of colluding with the West, of using any and every means they could to weaken the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans really didn't want to take the credit for their defeat by the Russians, so they blamed it all on the Armenians, which just added to the mixture of the hatred that they felt towards the Armenians. And at this point, they were looking for any excuse to just destroy the Armenians and just wipe this problem off of their docket. So as this quote shows, the chaos of World War I served as essentially a cover, almost like a smoke screen where people couldn't see in as clearly. And the Ottoman Empire knew this, and they took full advantage of this to just do what they've been wanting to do all along, and eventually they did. So the genocide itself was horrendous. I'll spare a lot of the more gruesome details out of an attempt to be less gratuitous and more focusing on the educational side of it. But it was absolutely horrendous and truly a dreadful death for nearly everyone. So the symbolic beginning of the Armenian Genocide was April 24th, 1915. It started with a ruse. Ottoman officials would come to an Armenian household and confiscate or appropriate the weapons, possibly saying that they need the weapons for the war effort, and they were confiscating everyone's weapons to go towards that, creating the idea that wasn't just focused on the Armenians, but more on everyone for the war effort. Then the men were recruited for work details and then taken away so they could work, many of them thinking that they were doing what they could to like help the empire through this war, and possibly mining for coal and anything that they could do to help for the war. Then the women, children, and elderly were given 3 days to prepare for relocation, possibly due to the reason that they were so close to Russia and Russia was invading. So for their safety, they would be relocated away. In reality, the men were taken away on these work details and executed. The women, children, and elderly were forced to march in lines towards the Arabian deserts. They were starved, tortured, ravaged, and dehydrated, and subjected to the most heinous things humans are capable of. It was beyond anything that could ever be described. They were slowly but surely marched towards the desert, starved to death, dehydrated, and then sometimes just outright killed by the Turkish people sent to guide them. And those that made it to the desert and weren't abducted by raiding Kurdish tribesmen, sold, as many of the young Armenian girls were, on slave markets, killed by their captors, or simply died from heat, from exhaustion, from starvation, from dehydration. Those that did survive and made it to the desert were run into the wastelands, the wells were poisoned, and they were kept out there until they died. So this travesty was just too impactful to truly describe. Henry Morgenthau was the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire and was there throughout the entirety of the ordeal. And he bore witness to a lot of the letters that people were sending him about what was actually happening. The missionaries and the people that wanted this to end would send letters and accounts, and then he would go and witness it for himself. And his description of just the crazed by the brutality of the protectors is just so impactful of how just the realization of what humans are capable of affected the Armenians, and how just a week ago they were just normal citizens of the empire, and now they're being marched to their death. And this account is from Henry Morgenthau as well, when he confronted one of the triumvirate, one of the top three people of the Ottoman Empire, about the Armenian Genocide and what was happening, and this was one of his responses, asking that the American life insurance policies companies be asked by the American government to make the Ottoman government the beneficiary of their life insurance policies. So they wanted the people that they were committing genocide against, they wanted to collect their life insurance policies, and they wanted the American government to endorse that. So in discussing these things, you may be wondering who precisely was responsible, in the hopes that maybe it was only maybe the top leading figures, maybe Talat sent down the orders and everyone else was just following orders. But it was far from just simply one bad apple. Every single layer, every single link seemed to be involved through the Ottoman government. The Triumvirate, which was the main three people in charge of the Committee for Union and Protection, the Parliament officially legalized the Armenian Genocide. The cabinet helped make the decision of the deportation and massacres. The Minister of the Interior sent officers to help guide the Armenians and keep them from revolting as they walked. The Ministry of War was in charge of eliminating any and all Armenians that were enrolled in the army and fighting for the Ottoman Empire, as well as sending military officers to also aid in the process. Governors of each district and provinces, the telegraph service, ministers, courts, constabularies, they were all involved. There was even the formation of new organizations, the special organization, which was predominantly made up of released criminals who had committed murder or mass murder in the past, that were then released and put into this government organization and then tasked with massacring the Armenians. The Commission on Immigrants, who would report back to the government on how the progress was going. The Commission on Abandoned Goods would seize the Armenian possessions, log them, and then send them to the government or auction them off and then send the money back to the government. And then Kurdish tribesmen were also allowed to sack and attack the caravans as they walked towards the government, killing people, kidnapping people, stealing what little possessions they had left. But there were some who attempted to aid the Armenians, and that mostly came down to individual Turks and Kurds that would house Armenians and protect them and try to keep them out of the caravans and lie to the Ottoman authorities when they'd come searching for them. And Christian missionaries in the areas who would do much of the same thing and would send letters both to Henry Morgenthau and back to their home governments explaining what was happening. So this comes to an interesting aspect of this genocide in particular, the conflicting stories. So there are those who believe and those who do not. There are those who read the witness testimonies, read the firsthand accounts, read the survivors' logs, and of course treat this as a part of history and describe how reason and emotion and just the hatred of the Armenians conspired together and led to a genocide. But there are some who believe that this never happened at all. They claim that there was no genocide and that the Armenians were actively trying to destroy the Ottoman government, and the Ottoman government actually did relocate them out of fear for its own stability. While those who actually do believe that it happened as described are in the far majority, those who do not are a loud minority, mostly appealing to the Turkish government today. So, the countries you see on screen right now are all of the countries in the world that officially recognize the Armenian Genocide, which is far, far fewer than there should be. So, hopping into a few case studies. Now, you may be congratulating yourself upon seeing the United States on the last screen as one of the few nations that officially recognizes the Armenian Genocide. which makes sense. We had Henry Morgenthau there. He spoke out against it. He combated it. He wrote back notes to the American government describing what it was like. He kept accounts. But the United States' recognition of the Armenian Genocide is recent. Very, very recent. The Senate Resolution 150 passed December 12th of 2019, officially recognizing the Armenian Genocide. So why did it take us so long? The key answer lies with Turkey. The Ottoman Empire, after the end of World War I, collapsed. And then the remnants of itself essentially reestablished itself in Turkey. And Turkey does not recognize the Armenian Genocide. And if you do, you find yourself very much on the bad side of Turkey, which the US certainly did not want to do, especially with the rise of the Cold War after World War II. Turkey was a member of NATO, so they certainly wanted to keep them in the loop of kind of holding back communism, and they really wanted to keep that Western stronghold more in the East. And while the Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba and threatening us, in the US, we were putting missiles in Turkey, our ally Turkey, to threaten the Russians. So this really kept us from doing anything that could possibly put our relationship with Turkey into jeopardy. So essentially, the fear of politics kept us from recognizing an international travesty. So why did we recognize it now? Turkey has been getting quite close with Russia as of late, and it is my belief that seeing Turkey slowly develop more of a strongman attitude with its current President Erdogan, and their close relationship with Russia, as well as their more recent willingness to stand against the United States, has finally given the United States kind of a clear bill of saying, okay, no matter what we do, even if we don't recognize it, they're still going to get close with Russia. They're still going to do whatever they want. So might as well finally recognize it, though it's sad it took way too long to do so. Then what many may find surprising is Israel, another country that was founded and the population of which had to endure its own harrowing genocide. And as I said before, throughout this, you may have seen very many parallels between the Armenians in World War I, pre-World War I, to the Jewish people in World War II and pre-World War II. But Israel does not recognize the Armenian Genocide for its own reasons. Upon my trip to Israel this past year, as we were walking through the Armenian corridor in Jerusalem, I asked our tour guide, who is kind of an expert in Israeli history, why Israel does not recognize the Armenian Genocide. And his answer came in the form of Azerbaijan. So essentially, Azerbaijan and Armenia are two rivals because they share borders and they're right next to each other. So in choosing who to side with between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Israel chose Azerbaijan as they already have a very close relationship with them, selling them lots of weapons, helping them with their defenses, and many other things. So in choosing the Azerbaijan side in the Armenian-Azerbaijan, not necessarily conflict, but more tension, in order to remain on the good side of Azerbaijan, they didn't need to, but they chose not to recognize the Armenian Genocide in order to appease them. This also comes in the form of an anti-Iranian sentiment, as Azerbaijan is on the other side of Iran, and Israel is hoping that Azerbaijan will be a useful ally in a place where, if the need should arise, Israeli planes can refuel after bombing Iran. And they would also be able to use their airspace for their planes and whatnot. There's also the fact that less so today, more so many years ago, Turkey and Israel were actually rather close, with many arms deals and defense agreements, both kind of against their mutual enemy in Syria. So in choosing to side with Turkey, and then today in choosing to side with Azerbaijan, it became more politically easier for them to not recognize the Armenian Genocide in order to appease these states. So this leaves us with a troubling legacy. And for the legacy of what happens when genocides are ignored and things like these are allowed to play out without international condemnation, what happens? And I'll leave that for you to ponder. And I'll just leave you with one last quote. I have issued the command. Now have anyone who utters but one word of criticism executed by firing squad. That our war aim does not consist in reaching certain lines, but in the physical destruction of the enemy. Accordingly, I have placed my death head formations in readiness, for the present only in the east, with orders to them to send to the death mercilessly and without compassion men, women, and children of Polish derivation and language. Only thus we shall gain the living space which we need. Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? Adolf Hitler, to his generals on the impending invasion of Poland. Thank you. I would like to say some thank yous today at the end of my SURF presentation. First to Dr. Pavlakis for letting me borrow so many books on the topic for the entirety of this school year, and for supporting me and encouraging me along every step of the way. I could not have done this without you. Thank you so much. And for helping me conquer my struggles with grammar and fragmented sentences. I cannot tell you how huge of a help he has been to me on this project every step of the way, and I couldn't have done it without him. So thank you so much. Dr. Faguglia, I would like to thank you for your endless support and encouragement and for lending me a book, Fires of Hatred, to study on this subject as well. And I would also like to thank you for logging on and viewing my presentation. Thank you so much. And here are the sources I used for this presentation. Once again, my name is McCabe Webb, and I would like to thank you so much for attending my SURF presentation. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.